Imagine you are holding a photograph. It is black and white, slightly blurred at the edges, the way photographs from the early 20th century tend to be. In the center of the frame, two men are hanging from the branch of a tree. Their bodies are limp. Their hands are tied behind their backs. Their necks are broken. But here's the thing that makes this photograph different from every other photograph of violence you have ever seen in your life. The crowd around them is smiling. Not a crowd of 2 or 3 people. Not a small group of men in hoods. A crowd of hundreds. Men in suits and ties. Women in church dresses. Children perched on their father's shoulders to get a better view. Teenagers grinning at the camera with the casual ease of people at a county fair. Some of them are looking directly into the lens. They want you to see them. They want you to know they were there. They are proud. This photograph was taken in Marion, Indiana, in August of 1930. The two men hanging from that tree were Thomas Shipp and Abner Smith, both black, both teenagers. They had been taken from the county jail by a mob of several thousand people, beaten nearly to death before they were even strung up, and then displayed for the better part of a night while the crowd grew and grew. Postcards were made from photographs like this one. They were sold. They were mailed. People wrote notes on the back. Vacation greetings. Holiday wishes. Sent through the United States Postal Service with a federal stamp. Now I want you to hold that image in your mind, not because I want you to suffer, but because what you need to understand right now, before we go a single step further, is that what we are about to talk about was not secret. It was not hidden. It was celebrated. And that is the thing that almost no one tells you. That is the fact that has been quietly buried under 70 years of American amnesia. The lynching era in the United States of America was not the work of fringe extremists operating in the shadows. It was not the action of a few deranged individuals that the rest of decent society condemned. It was a mass public institution. It was attended by thousands. It was photographed, printed, mailed, and sold as entertainment. And the people who carried it out, in thousands of towns across 32 states, almost never faced a single consequence. Between 1877 and 1950, at least 4,084 Black Americans were lynched in the American South alone. Let me say that again, because that number is easy to read too fast. 4,084 documented cases. In the South, in 73 years. That is one lynching every 6.5 days. Every single day of every single year. For 7 decades. And the word documented is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Because historians who have spent careers studying this period believe the true total is significantly higher. Many killings were never recorded. Many were covered up by the very sheriffs and judges who were supposed to investigate them. Many happened in counties so remote and so hostile to outside inquiry that no one outside those counties ever learned of them at all. But here is the thing that I want you to sit with. Here is the thread that is going to run through everything we examine today. The question that historians have debated, that survivors carried in their bodies to their graves, and that the American government has still, as of this recording, never fully answered. Who was really running this? Because the evidence, the actual documentary evidence that was buried for decades, suggests that lynching in America was not primarily mob violence at all. Not in the way we have been taught to think about mobs. It was, in many places, in many counties, a coordinated system. It had participants in law enforcement. It had participants in local government. It had the silent approval, and often the active assistance, of state officials who had the power to stop it and chose not to. And there is a paper trail. There are telegrams. There are letters. There are newspaper editorials that functioned as open invitations to violence. There are sheriffs who conveniently stepped away from their jails on the nights mobs arrived. There are governors who received direct requests for intervention and did nothing. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the documented historical record. And by the end of what we are going to examine together, you are going to understand something that most Americans have never been taught, that the lynching era was not a failure of American justice. It was American justice, functioning exactly as it was designed to function for Black Americans living under Jim Crow. We begin in 1877. you have to understand what was destroyed first. Because the lynching era did not emerge from nothing. It was a response. It was a weapon. And to understand what it was a weapon against, you need to understand what the years immediately after the Civil War actually looked like. Because here is something that the standard American education almost never teaches adequately. Reconstruction worked. Not perfectly. Not without violence. Not without enormous struggle. But in the years between 1865 and 1877, something genuinely extraordinary happened in the American South. Black men voted. Black men held political office. Black men served in state legislatures, in Congress, as sheriffs, as judges, as school board members. Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce represented Mississippi in the United States Senate. Joseph Rainey of South Carolina became the first black congressman to serve in the House of Representatives. By 1870, over 700 black men held elected office across the South. Let me say that clearly, so it lands properly. Less than 5 years after the end of chattel slavery, black men were serving as United States senators. And it was not just politics. Black communities across the South were building. Schools were established at a rate that astonished outside observers. Churches became the center of community life and political organizing simultaneously. Land was being purchased. Businesses were opening. Towns were incorporating. A class of black professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and ministers was emerging and growing. It was fragile, underfunded, opposed at every turn by white resistance, and operating under the constant threat of violence. But it was real, and it was gaining. This is what Reconstruction was, and this is what white Southern power could not tolerate. The terror campaigns against black political organizing did not begin after Reconstruction ended. They began while Reconstruction was still happening, while federal troops were still present, while the constitutional amendments were still new. The Ku Klux Klan, the White League, the Red Shirts, these were not spontaneous grassroots reactions to some perceived injustice. They were organized paramilitary operations designed specifically to do one thing: drive black Americans out of political and economic life by making the cost of participation in that life unbearable. They murdered black office holders. They burned black schools. They attacked black churches. They killed voters on their way to polling places and murdered the men who ran them. In Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873, a white paramilitary force massacred approximately 150 black men, many of them after they had already surrendered and left their bodies in the open for weeks. A federal prosecution followed. It reached the Supreme Court, and in 1876, the Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Cruikshank that the federal government could not protect black citizens from private violence. That individual states were responsible for their own citizens' safety, that the 14th Amendment only applied to state action, not private action. Think about what that ruling meant in practice. Think about what it meant in a state where the governor was aligned with the Klan, where the sheriffs were members of the White League, where the judges attended the same churches as the men who planned the killings. The Supreme Court had just told those men, the federal government will not stop you. You are on your own. Which, from the perspective of the men committing the violence, meant you are free. Then came 1877. The presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden ended in dispute. Electoral votes from 3 southern states were contested. The resolution was a political deal, the Compromise of 1877, that gave Hayes the presidency in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. With the troops gone, Reconstruction was over. Not formally, not with a single announcement, but functionally, immediately, completely. The thin federal umbrella that had been protecting black political life in the South was folded up and taken away, and what followed was the most systematic rollback of civil rights in American history. Within 5 years, black voter registration in Mississippi dropped from almost 100% to nearly zero. Poll taxes were enacted. Literacy tests were invented and applied selectively. White primaries were established, making Republican Party membership irrelevant in one-party states. Constitutional amendments were circumvented, laws were rewritten, and the enforcement mechanism for all of it, the tool that made disenfranchisement and economic subjugation stick, the instrument that made sure no black person would ever again risk asserting the rights that the Constitution technically still guaranteed, was terror. Specifically, the rope. I want to be very precise about something, because precision matters here. When we use the word lynching, we are not talking about one type of event. We are talking about a category that encompasses a range of actions, all of which share the same essential feature: extrajudicial killing carried out by a group with community knowledge and often community participation, designed to enforce a racial and economic hierarchy. Some lynchings were carried out in private, in the middle of the night, by small groups. A man taken from his home, a body found in a creek the next morning, a coroner who ruled it death by unknown causes and moved on. But the vast majority of documented lynchings in the peak decades of this era, from the 1880s through the 1920s, were public events, announced in advance, attended by crowds, reported in local newspapers, sometimes the same newspapers that had published the original accusation, sometimes the very same editors who had written the editorials calling for violence. Here is how it worked in practice. In the counties where it was most systematized, a black man would be accused of something. The charge was usually one of a small number of things. Assault on a white woman was the most common, and it is important to understand immediately that historians have established conclusively that in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, the accusation was false. IdaBWells, the journalist who would dedicate her life to documenting and fighting the lynching epidemic, published an investigation in 1892 called Southern Horrors, in which she demonstrated, using the public record, using the newspapers, using the statements of white witnesses, that the accusations of rape and assault that triggered the majority of lynchings were fabrications, sometimes completely invented, sometimes descriptions of consensual relationships that white family members refused to accept, sometimes cases of mistaken identity, sometimes the result of personal or economic disputes in which a false accusation was a convenient weapon. But there were other charges too: talking back to a white man, touching a white woman accidentally, owning land that a white neighbor wanted, starting a business that competed with a white-owned one, voting, attempting to vote, organizing other black workers to demand fair wages, testifying against a white man in court, witnessing something a powerful white man did not want witnessed. The accusation, once made, moved through a specific sequence. The local newspaper would publish it in inflammatory terms. Words like fiend, brute, and monster were standard. Details were rarely verified. Named suspects were described as guilty before any proceeding had taken place. The editorial might note that the citizens of the county were understandably enraged, that they could hardly be expected to remain calm, that the law was slow and uncertain, that justice demanded something more immediate. This was not accidental language. It was an invitation. The sheriff would be notified that a mob was forming. Often the sheriff had been notified before the newspaper went to print. In case after case, documented case after documented case, the sheriff responded to this notification by making himself unavailable, by leaving town, by entrusting the jail to a single deputy who would unlock the door when the mob arrived, by claiming afterward that the crowd had been too large, too determined, too overwhelming to resist. None of these sheriffs were ever prosecuted. Many were re-elected. The mob would arrive. The prisoner would be taken. What followed was not always quick. Historians have documented cases in which victims were tortured for hours in front of crowds of thousands, in which body parts were removed as souvenirs, in which victims were burned alive while the crowd watched and cheered. These details are not included here for shock value. They are included because the scale and the spectacle of the violence was intentional. It was designed to be seen. It was designed to travel. It was designed to reach every black family in every surrounding county and communicate a single message with perfect clarity. This is what happens. This is what we will do, and no one will stop us. The body would be left hanging, sometimes for days. Sometimes the family would be prevented from retrieving it. Sometimes the body would be mutilated further after death. The local newspaper would run a follow-up article describing the event in the language of satisfied justice. Phrases like, "the community has spoken," and "swift retribution" appeared regularly. National wire services picked up many of these stories and distributed them across the country. And then, nothing. No arrests, no trials, no consequences. Because in virtually every county in the Deep South in the peak decades of the lynching era, the men in the mob were the same men who served on grand juries, who sat as judges, who wore the sheriff's badge, who wrote the newspaper editorials, who ran the banks that held black sharecroppers' debt, who owned the land that black tenant farmers worked. The system was not failing to respond to the violence. The system was the violence. 4,084 documented lynchings. That is the number compiled by the Equal Justice Initiative in their landmark 2015 report, Lynching in America, which remains the most comprehensive analysis of the historical record ever published. It covers 12 southern states from 1877 to 1950 and is based on contemporaneous newspaper accounts, court records, NAACP files, and academic research accumulated over more than a century. But the EJI's count is of the South only. When you add documented lynchings in northern and western states, the number rises substantially. Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kansas, California, Nebraska. Lynchings occurred in at least 32 of the 48 states that existed during the peak era. Mississippi had the highest documented total, 654. Over 650 murders, most of which resulted in 0 arrests and 0 prosecutions, in a single state over 7 decades. Georgia was second with 531, Texas with 492, Louisiana with 391, Alabama with 360. Certain counties were, by the historical record, killing fields. Leflore County, Mississippi, Yazoo County, Mississippi, Brooks County, Georgia. These were places where the terror was so thorough, so complete, that black residents understood their continued existence there to be conditional on total submission. Any assertion of rights, any departure from the enforced codes of deference, any economic success that exceeded what white neighbors considered acceptable, could be, and frequently was, a death sentence. And here is something that is almost never taught. The victims were not only men. At least 159 black women were lynched in this period. Women accused of defending their husbands. Women accused of being accomplices to black men who had asserted themselves in some way. Women accused of nothing at all, killed simply because they were present when a mob came for the men in their families, and the mob did not want witnesses. Mary Turner, 8 months pregnant, was lynched in Brooks County, Georgia, in May of 1918, after she publicly protested the lynching of her husband. A crowd of several hundred people killed her in a manner so savage that the full details remain almost unprintable more than a century later. A local newspaper noted her death in 4 sentences. Children were lynched, teenagers were lynched, men in their 70s were lynched. And in at least 41% of documented cases, according to the EJI's analysis, the victims had not been accused of any criminal offense at all. They were killed for economic competition, for social assertion, for nothing more than the perceived failure to demonstrate adequate deference to a white person's authority. Now, I told you at the beginning that there is a mystery at the center of this story, a thread that has never been fully pulled, that leads somewhere that the American historical consensus has never quite been willing to go. Here it is. The United States Congress attempted to pass a federal anti-lynching bill more than 200 times between 1900 and 1952. More than 200 times. The bills were blocked every single time. Blocked specifically by Southern senators using a procedural tool you may recognize, the filibuster. Between 1922 and 1938 alone, 3 major anti-lynching bills passed the House of Representatives with substantial majorities and were killed in the Senate. The Dyer Bill of 1922, the Costigan-Wagner Act of 1934, the Gavigan-Wagner-Van Nuys Bill of 1938, each one killed by senators who stood on the Senate floor for hours, days, sometimes weeks, and talked and talked and talked until the bill died. These men had names. They had constituents. They had donors. They wrote letters and gave speeches and shook hands at fundraisers in Washington. They were not anonymous. They were not rogue actors. They were the senior elected representatives of American states, and they made an explicit, deliberate, documented, public choice to protect the right of their constituents to murder Black Americans without federal interference. For 50 years, across multiple presidential administrations, through 2 world wars, and the federal government let them. No president between 1877 and 1952 made the passage of an anti-lynching law a priority. Not one. Woodrow Wilson, whose administration resegregated the federal government and screened The Birth of a Nation, a film that celebrated the Klan in the White House, actively opposed federal intervention. Franklin Roosevelt, who accepted Black votes and Black political support, refused to push for anti-lynching legislation because he needed Southern Democrats to pass his New Deal programs. The letter he wrote to NAACP Executive Secretary Walter White in 1934 explaining why he would not publicly support the Costigan-Wagner bill is one of the most devastating documents in American political history. The needs of the economy, he implied, outweighed the problem of Black people being murdered. The United States Senate did not formally apologize for its repeated failure to pass anti-lynching legislation until 2005. Not 1965, not 1985, 2005. And even then, 80 senators did not sign the resolution. A formal federal anti-lynching law, designating lynching as a federal hate crime, was not signed into law until March of 2022. 2022, 145 years after the lynching era began. Now here is where I want to leave you for this first section, because I want you to sit with this question, the way the historians who uncovered this evidence have sat with it. If the lynching era was just mob violence, just eruptions of local hatred that no one could control, why did it require 50 years of sustained legislative effort to block a federal response? Why did it require the coordinated action of an entire wing of the United States Senate, wielding a specific procedural tool, again and again and again, across decades, to prevent the federal government from treating murder as murder? You block a law that hard, for that long, because you need the thing the law would prohibit. You need the terror to keep working. We are going to follow that thread. We are going to follow it through the specific men who ran this system, through the economics that made it essential to certain interests, through the documented cases that reveal its inner workings, through the people who risked and sacrificed everything to fight it, and through the question that has never been fully answered. What did the United States government know? When did it know it? And what did it decide to do about it? The answers are worse than most people have ever been told. This is the story of the lynching era. There is a question that economists ask when they study the American South in the decades after Reconstruction. If sharecropping was so profitable for landowners, why did so many Black sharecroppers remain poor their entire lives, even in years of good harvests, even in years when cotton prices were high, even when the numbers on the ledger should have produced a surplus? The answer that took historians decades to fully document is not complicated. It just requires you to be willing to follow the logic of a system built entirely on coercion all the way to its end. Black sharecroppers in the Deep South after 1877 could not leave. Not legally, not safely, not without risking everything. A sharecropper who tried to leave before his debt to the landowner was settled could be arrested under vagrancy laws that were specifically written to make any Black man without a white employer a criminal. A sharecropper who disputed the landowner's accounting of what he owed could be accused of insubordination, or theft, or any of a dozen other charges that carried sentences of hard labor. And a sharecropper who organized other Black workers to demand fair wages, who wrote letters to newspapers, who made contact with Northern labor organizers, who attempted to document the theft that was being committed against him systematically and in writing, faced something worse than arrest. He faced the rope. The lynching era was not incidentally connected to the economic exploitation of Black labor in the American South. It was the enforcement mechanism of that exploitation. It was the tool that made the theft possible. Without the constant ambient threat of extrajudicial violence, without the knowledge in every black household in every sharecropping county that any assertion of economic rights could end in a public murder, the entire system of peonage that replaced chattel slavery would have collapsed within a decade. The men who owned the land and controlled the courts and wrote the vagrancy laws understood this perfectly well. The terror was not a byproduct of racism operating independently of economic interest. The terror and the economic interest were the same thing, serving the same people, administered through the same county courthouses and the same county sheriffs. This is what historians now call racial capitalism in its most naked form, and it ran for 70 years. Let me give you the economics in concrete terms, because abstractions are easy to dismiss and numbers are harder. In 1910, approximately 89% of black Americans in the South were engaged in agricultural labor. The overwhelming majority of them were sharecroppers or tenant farmers, working land owned by white landlords under contracts that the landlords wrote, interpreted, and enforced. The typical arrangement was that the sharecropper would receive half the crop value at harvest in exchange for his labor. Out of that half, he would repay the furnishings the landlord had advanced during the year: seed, tools, food, clothing, all purchased on credit at the landlord's store at prices the landlord set. The accounting was done by the landlord. The sharecropper had no independent access to the figures. In most counties, black sharecroppers were functionally illiterate because the states had spent decades deliberately denying black children adequate schooling, so disputing the figures was difficult, even for those who understood the arithmetic. In the states with the highest lynching rates, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, independent audits of sharecropping accounts in the early 20th century found that black sharecroppers were being systematically underpaid, overcharged, and kept in perpetual debt through fraudulent bookkeeping at rates that exceeded 90% of accounts examined. 90%. In study after study, county after county. And when a man discovered he had been robbed, when he refused to sign the account, when he went to a lawyer or wrote to the state agricultural board, or simply raised his voice, the system had a response ready. That response had a name in the counties where it was most efficiently administered. They called it getting out of hand. And getting out of hand in Leflore County, Mississippi, or in Telfair County, Georgia, or in Wharton County, Texas, was a designation with one standard remedy. The economics flowed upward from the individual farm to the county to the state. Cotton factors in Memphis and New Orleans and Savannah processed the crops. Banks in those cities financed the plantations. Insurance companies in New York held the policies on the land and the equipment. Textile mills in the American Northeast and in England bought the cotton. The entire chain of profit that ran from a black man's unpaid labor in a Mississippi field to a shirt on a department store rack in Boston was lubricated at every point by the threat of violence that kept that man in the field, kept him quiet, kept him from leaving, and kept him from organizing. This is not a peripheral fact about the lynching era. This is the central fact about the lynching era. And it explains something that pure racial hatred alone does not adequately explain, which is why the terror was so geographically concentrated, so temporally consistent, and so specifically targeted at exactly the categories of black economic and political behavior that threatened the extractive system. Black professionals were lynched in disproportionately high numbers relative to their share of the black population. Landowners, businessmen, farmers who owned their own land and therefore had no debt to leverage. These were the people whose existence most directly challenged the fiction that black subjugation was natural and inevitable rather than enforced and maintained by violence. They were killed at rates that make clear their success was understood as a provocation. In 1916, Anthony Crawford, a successful black farmer in Abbeville, South Carolina, owned 427 acres of land, had 14 children, and was considered one of the most prosperous black men in his county. He got into a dispute with a white cotton broker over the price of cottonseed. He refused to accept a price he considered dishonest. He was arrested, removed from the jail by a mob, and lynched. His land was subsequently purchased by white neighbors at a fraction of its value. His family was run out of the county. This was not an exceptional case. It was a pattern so consistent across so many counties over so many decades that it constitutes something close to a policy. In 1892, 3 black men were lynched in Memphis, Tennessee. Their names were Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart. They were not accused of violence against a white woman. They were not accused of any crime involving a person at all. They were lynched because their grocery store, the People's Grocery, was doing well enough to draw customers away from a white-owned store nearby. The white store owner arranged a confrontation. The 3 men defended themselves. They were arrested, taken from the jail, and murdered. A 29-year-old journalist and co-owner of a black newspaper called Free Speech and Headlight wrote about it. Her name was IdaBWells, and what she wrote was not a lament. It was not a plea. It was an investigation. Thomas Moss was her friend. She had been the godmother of his daughter, and rather than grieve quietly, she began to do what she had been trained to do. She started pulling records. She started reading every lynching report she could find across the country, every newspaper account, every court document, every coroner's report. She started asking the specific, precise questions that no one in the mainstream American press was asking. What were the actual charges? What was the actual evidence? What was the relationship between the accusation and the underlying facts? What she found, documented in meticulous detail in her 1892 pamphlet, Southern Horrors, and in her 1895 book, A Red Record, was exactly what we discussed in Part 1. That the rape accusation, the charge that white Southerners used most insistently to justify lynching, and that much of the Northern press accepted without scrutiny, was in the overwhelming majority of documented cases either completely fabricated or a description of a consensual relationship. That in at least 1/3 of all lynching cases she could document, the victim had not been accused of rape or sexual assault at all. That the primary drivers of lynching were economic competition, political organizing, and the assertion of basic human dignity. She published these findings. She named names. She named counties. She published the evidence in a black-owned newspaper with a national circulation among the black community. The response from white Memphis was immediate. While she was traveling, a mob destroyed her newspaper office. Destroyed it completely. Smashed the presses, broke the type, ransacked the building, and published a notice in a white newspaper saying that if she ever returned to Memphis, she would be lynched. She was effectively exiled from the South for decades. She never returned to live there. But she did not stop. She took her investigation to England, to Scotland, to the international press. She spoke to British audiences, to trade union organizations, to reform groups, to anyone who would listen. She understood something that other American reformers were slower to grasp. That international pressure, specifically British pressure, carried economic weight that the American South could not entirely ignore, because the British textile industry was one of the largest consumers of Southern cotton. A British campaign against goods produced under terror had the potential to cost money, and money was, as we have established, the point of the entire enterprise. She founded anti-lynching organizations. She organized boycotts. She testified before audiences of thousands and documented the response of white Southern officials, who responded to her work with exactly the kind of furious dismissal that historically accompanies the accurate public naming of a profitable crime. Wells did not end the lynching era. The forces arrayed against her were too powerful, too entrenched, too embedded in the legal and economic structure of the country for one journalist, however rigorous and however fearless, to dismantle. But she did something that had enormous long-term consequences. She established, with documentation that has stood up to more than a century of historical scrutiny, that the lynching era was a system and not a series of spontaneous eruptions. She created the evidentiary foundation on which every subsequent effort to fight it would be built. And she did it in 1892, while the system was still in full operation, while the men who ran it were still in office, and still capable of killing her. Remember her name when someone tells you that individuals cannot change the course of history. November 10th, 1898. Wilmington, North Carolina. I want to walk you through this day carefully, because it is one of the most important events in American political history. It directly illustrates the relationship between racial terror and governmental power at their most explicit intersection, and it is almost entirely absent from standard American history curricula. In 1898, Wilmington was the largest city in North Carolina. It had a majority black population. It had a functioning biracial city government that had been in place since Reconstruction, maintained through a fusion alliance between black Republican voters and white Populist Party members who had found common economic ground. The city's government included black aldermen, a black police chief, and a black-owned newspaper, the Daily Record, operated by a man named Alexander Manly. In October of 1898, a prominent white supremacist politician named Alfred Moore Waddell gave a speech in which he called on white men to take back the city. He was explicit. He said that if necessary, they should use the gun and the torch. This was not a private communication. It was a public speech reported in newspapers. Waddell was not a fringe figure. He was a former congressman, a respected member of Wilmington society, and a man with connections to the state Democratic Party apparatus. On November 8th, an election was held. The Democrats won the state legislature through a combination of ballot stuffing, voter intimidation, and the physical prevention of black voters from reaching the polls in multiple counties. It was not a close or contested election. It was a stolen one. Contemporary observers, including Republican election officials and Northern journalists, documented the fraud in real time. But the Democrats had won only the state legislature, not the city of Wilmington's local government. And so, on the morning of November 10th, 2 days after the election, a mob of approximately 2,000 armed white men, organized in advance, equipped with a rapid-fire Gatling gun, marched to the offices of Alexander Manly's Daily Record and burned the building to the ground. Then they marched on City Hall. The elected mayor, the elected alderman, and the elected police chief were forced at gunpoint to resign their offices. Immediately. On the spot. Without any legal proceeding, without any court order, without any election, without any process recognized by the Constitution of the United States of America. They were replaced, that same day, by men of Waddell's choosing. Waddell installed himself as mayor. Between 10 and 60 black residents were killed in the streets during the events of that day. Historians have been unable to establish a precise toll because many bodies were disposed of without any official record. Hundreds of black residents fled into the surrounding swamps and did not return. Hundreds more were expelled from the city in the days that followed. Prominent black businessmen and professionals, men who had built lives and careers and property over decades, were given hours to leave and told they would be killed if they came back. The governor of North Carolina did nothing. The President of the United States, William McKinley, did nothing. The federal government took no action. No one was prosecuted. No one was arrested. The coup held. Waddell served as mayor of Wilmington until 1906. This is the only successful coup d'etat in American history. It was carried out in broad daylight by men whose names are in the historical record, with a weapon that was transported across city streets in advance, in a city large enough to have multiple newspaper offices, witnessed by dozens of journalists and officials. It was reported in northern newspapers at the time, and it was allowed to stand. Now I want to ask you the same question the historians ask when they work through these documents. How does a coup happen in an American city in 1898 and no federal response follows? Not a slow response. Not an inadequate response. No response at all. The answer requires you to understand something about the federal government's calculation in this period that most American history education is very reluctant to make explicit. The federal government, specifically the executive branch, had made a determination after the Compromise of 1877 that the restoration of white democratic control over southern state governments was a political necessity for national stability. That the reunification of the country, meaning the reintegration of white southern political power into the National Democratic Coalition, was a higher priority than the constitutional rights of black citizens in those states, that the votes and the lives of black Southerners were, in the final analysis, expendable in service of that larger political project. This was not a secret position. It was stated in various forms by various officials, but it was also not something any administration was willing to put directly on paper, because to do so would be to acknowledge explicitly that the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were being selectively enforced based on race, which they were, every day, for decades. Wilmington was not an outlier. It was a demonstration of what could be done, of how far the violence could go, of how complete the seizure of power could be, and of exactly how much the federal government would tolerate. The answer turned out to be everything. Here's something that takes most people by surprise when they first encounter it. The men who ran the lynching era were not careful about hiding their coordination. They wrote letters. They sent telegrams. They published manifestos. They gave speeches at political rallies. They held conventions. The White League published its objectives. The Red Shirts coordinated their activities openly. Democratic Party officials in multiple southern states corresponded directly with paramilitary organizations about the logistics of voter suppression, up to and including the use of violence. In South Carolina, in the 1876 elections, Democratic Party officials distributed a document that has come to be known as the Plan of Campaign. It instructed Democratic clubs in explicit terms to control black voters by any means necessary, to arm themselves, to practice with their weapons, and to be prepared to use them. This document survives. It is in archives. Historians have held it. It was written by men whose names are in the congressional record. In Mississippi, what became known as the Mississippi Plan was an explicit program of terror designed to suppress the black vote. It was discussed in Democratic Party meetings. It was referenced in newspaper editorials. Former Governor James K. Vardaman of Mississippi said in a public speech in 1903 that he would rather a black man not be allowed to vote even if he were the most qualified man in the state, because allowing it would mean having to kill more of them. He was not prosecuted for incitement. He was elected United States Senator from Mississippi in 1911. Senator Ben Tillman of South Carolina boasted on the floor of the United States Senate in 1900 that he had personally participated in the murder of black citizens during the campaign of 1876. This was a sitting senator, speaking in the United States Senate chamber, confessing to murder. He was not removed from the Senate. He was not prosecuted. He served in the Senate until his death in 1918. There is a statue of him on the grounds of the South Carolina State House. These are not buried documents that took decades of archival research to uncover. These are speeches in the congressional record. These are newspaper articles available on microfilm in public libraries. These are letters that the men who wrote them saw no reason to hide, because they were operating in a legal and political environment in which what they were doing was understood by everyone with power to be acceptable. The paper trail is not a mystery. The paper trail is the history. What is missing from the standard American telling of this history is not the evidence. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look at it. What is missing is the willingness to follow the evidence to its logical conclusion, which is that the lynching era was not a failure of American institutions. It was American institutions, functioning as designed for the people they were designed to serve. And the people they were designed to serve were not black Americans. Here's where the mystery I mentioned at the beginning starts to become something more than a question. Because if you accept the evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming, that the lynching era was a coordinated, organized, economically motivated, institutionally supported system of racial terror that ran for 7 decades and was protected by the United States Senate through more than 200 legislative defeats, then you have to ask a harder question than simply, how did this happen? You have to ask, who specifically benefited? Who were the financial beneficiaries of a labor system that required this level of violence to sustain? How far up did the knowledge of what was being done and the decision to allow it to continue actually go? And the answers, which we are going to examine in detail in the sections ahead, will take you somewhere that most American textbooks have never been willing to go. Because some of those beneficiaries had names you will recognize. Some of them sat in offices in Washington. Some of them built institutions that still exist. And some of the decisions made to protect this system, made at the highest levels of American government, were made in full knowledge of what was happening in those southern counties, with full access to the documentation that IdaBWells and the NAACP were producing, and an explicit written response to requests for federal intervention that they chose to deny. We are going to follow the money. We are going to follow the letters. We are going to follow the decisions made by men with power when confronted with evidence of mass murder. Decisions they made in writing. Decisions that are in archives waiting to be read. And when we get to the end of that trail, I think you will understand why the United States Senate waited until 2005 to apologize, and why even that apology was non-binding, and why 80 senators chose not to sign it. Because an apology that carries legal weight is an apology that opens a door. And behind that door is a reckoning this country has spent 150 years refusing to face. There is a company you have heard of. Its products are in stores across the country right now. Its history is taught in business schools as a model of American industrial success. Its founding story is celebrated. Its early executives are quoted in management textbooks. It has endowed university chairs and named buildings at prestigious institutions. It is, by every measure of American corporate respectability, legitimate. It was also, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, one of the largest buyers of convict labor in the American South. Labor extracted from black men arrested on false charges, held in conditions that a 1908 federal investigation described as worse than slavery, worked until they died in mines and lumber camps and turpentine forests, their bodies sometimes buried where they fell with no record of their names. I am not going to name the company right now. Not because I am protecting it, but because I want you to understand, before I name it, exactly what it was buying. I want you to understand what the convict leasing system was, what it did to the people trapped inside it, and who made money from every year it ran. Then I will name it. And when I do, I want the name to land the way it deserves to land. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in December of 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. It contained one clause, one exception, one sentence that would be used within months of its ratification to reconstruct the system it had just abolished in a slightly different legal form. Except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Except as a punishment for crime. Within 2 years of the amendment's passage, Southern states had enacted what were known as black codes, laws that criminalized behavior specific to black Americans. Vagrancy, meaning being unemployed without a white employer's authorization. Loitering. Insulting gestures. Breaking a labor contract. These offenses carried sentences of hard labor. The men convicted of them were leased by the state to private companies that paid the state a fee per prisoner per day, and were then entitled to work those prisoners however they chose. The state made money. The company got labor it paid almost nothing for. The prisoner had no rights, no recourse, and no release date he could count on, because the debt he was accumulating for his food, his clothing, and his housing, all charged to him by the company at rates the company set, frequently extended his sentence indefinitely. Historians Douglas Blackman, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book Slavery by Another Name, spent more than a decade documenting this system using the records of a single company, United States Steel, and what he found in those corporate records, in the payroll ledgers and the lease agreements and the correspondence between company executives and county sheriffs, was the operational machinery of a system that re-enslaved tens of thousands of black Americans in the decades after emancipation. The company I told you about at the beginning of this section is United States Steel. At its peak, it was one of the largest companies in the world. Its founder, Andrew Carnegie, is remembered as a philanthropist. The libraries he built bear his name in cities across America, and in the counties of Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi, where his company leased convicts, Black men were worked to death in coal mines and iron furnaces under conditions that company supervisors documented and occasionally complained about internally because the death rate was high enough to affect productivity. This is in the records. This is documented. This is not speculation or accusation. It is in the corporate archives that Douglas Blackman spent years reading. And United States Steel was not alone. Tennessee, coal and iron, Georgia's turpentine camps, the railroad construction companies that built lines across the South, the lumber operations in Florida and Mississippi. All of them participated in the leasing system to varying degrees. All of them benefited from the legal architecture of black criminalization. All of them had an economic interest in the maintenance of a system that kept black labor cheap, controlled, and unable to organize. And all of them operated in counties where lynching was used to enforce the broader regime of racial control that made the convict leasing system possible. The two systems, extrajudicial terror and legal forced labor, were not separate institutions. They were complementary instruments of the same economic project. Lynching kept black free workers from organizing. Convict leasing captured those who could not be kept in line by terror alone and extracted their labor at gunpoint under color of law. By 1898, the convict leasing system in Alabama alone was generating revenue equivalent to approximately 40% of the entire state budget. The state of Alabama was, in a meaningful fiscal sense, dependent on the forced labor of black men arrested on fraudulent charges for its financial functioning. The sheriffs who made those arrests received fees per prisoner delivered. The judges who sentenced them had political relationships with the companies that purchased the leases. The governors who signed the lease agreements attended the same churches and the same club dinners as the company executives who wrote the checks. The money flowed. The men died. The records were kept. Between 1890 and 1920, lynching in the United States reached its statistical peak. These were the decades that produced the highest annual totals, the largest documented single events, and the most elaborate public spectacles of racial violence in American history. They were also the decades in which the modern American industrial economy was being built, in which the United States was becoming the world's largest economic power, and in which the federal government was most thoroughly controlled by men who had made an explicit political accommodation with Southern white supremacy. 1906. Atlanta, Georgia. In September of that year, Atlanta newspapers published a series of reports about alleged assaults by black men on white women. The reports were inflammatory, largely unverified, and in some cases, provably false. The Atlanta Evening News ran a front-page story on September 22nd with a headline that historians have cited as one of the most direct incitements to violence in American newspaper history. That evening, white mobs began attacking black residents throughout the city. The rioting continued for 4 days. Black-owned businesses along Decatur Street were destroyed. Black residents were pulled from streetcars and beaten. The barbershop in the Piedmont Hotel was attacked because it employed black barbers who cut the hair of white customers, a visible symbol of black economic participation that the mob found intolerable. By the time the National Guard restored order, between 25 and 40 black residents had been killed, hundreds had been injured, and the economic infrastructure of Atlanta's black community had been substantially destroyed. The newspaper editors who published the stories that started the riot were never charged with anything. 1917, East St. Louis, Illinois. Here I want to pause on the geography, because it matters. East St. Louis is not in the South. It is in Illinois, a northern state, a state that had not had slavery for half a century, a state where black Americans could vote. And what happened there in July of 1917 is essential to understanding that the lynching era was not a regional pathology confined to the former Confederacy. It was an American pathology that followed black Americans wherever they went. During the Great Migration, black workers had been recruited to East St. Louis to work in its meatpacking plants and aluminum factories. White union members, who had previously excluded black workers from their unions, complained that black workers were being used to undercut their wages. The complaint was legitimate in its economic dimension, but the response was not directed at the companies doing the hiring or at the political conditions that made black workers desperate enough to accept lower wages. The response was directed at the black workers themselves. On July 2nd, white mobs attacked black neighborhoods throughout East St. Louis. Homes were set on fire with residents inside. People attempting to flee burning buildings were beaten and shot. The National Guard was present, but, in many documented instances, stood aside or participated in the attacks. A congressional investigation afterward found that the death toll was at minimum 100, and, in the estimate of some investigators, as high as 250. More than 6,000 black residents were driven from their homes. The property destruction ran into millions of dollars. W.E.B. Du Bois traveled to East St. Louis in the aftermath. What he reported was not the account of a Southern racial ritual. It was the account of a Northern industrial city choosing racial massacre over labor solidarity, with the acquiescence of state and local government. 1919. The Red Summer. The name was given by James Weldon Johnson, then Field Secretary of the NAACP, who used the word red to mean blood. And blood there was. In more than 25 cities across the country between April and November of 1919, white mobs attacked black communities. Chicago, Knoxville, Omaha, Washington, D.C. itself, where mobs attacked black residents 4 blocks from the White House while President Woodrow Wilson was in residence. In Chicago, the riot began when a black teenager named Eugene Williams crossed an invisible line in Lake Michigan that separated the black swimming area from the white swimming area. He was stoned. He drowned. The police officer on the scene refused to arrest the white man who threw the stones. 13 days of violence followed. 38 people were killed, 23 black and 15 white. More than 500 were injured. 1,000 black families lost their homes to arson. But for the purposes of understanding what the lynching era really was at its most systematic, I want to focus on one event from the Red Summer that receives almost no attention in standard American history: the Elaine Massacre, Phillips County, Arkansas, September and October, 1919. In the fall of 1919, black sharecroppers in Phillips County, Arkansas, were attempting something that the economic system we described in the last chapter was specifically designed to prevent. They were organizing. The Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America had been quietly establishing chapters among black sharecroppers in Phillips County for months. The union had a specific purpose: to hire lawyers and obtain an independent audit of the sharecroppers' accounts with white landlords. They believed, correctly, that they were being systematically cheated out of their cotton profits through fraudulent accounting. They wanted documentation. They wanted legal representation. They wanted, through strictly legal means, to know how much they had been robbed. On the night of September 30th, union members gathered at a church in the community of Hoopspur for a meeting. A group of white men, including a deputy sheriff and a security agent for a Missouri Pacific Railroad, approached the church and fired into it. The sharecroppers fired back in self-defense. One white man was killed. What followed was not a riot. What followed was a military operation. The governor of Arkansas, Charles Brow, requested federal troops from the War Department. He received them. 500 soldiers of the United States Army were deployed to Phillips County. They did not deploy to protect black sharecroppers from white violence. They deployed to, in the language of the official Army report, suppress the Negro insurrection. There was no insurrection. There had been a self-defense shooting after armed white men fired into a church. But the word insurrection was useful because it allowed what followed to be described as military necessity. Over the next several days, white mobs, encouraged and in some cases accompanied by soldiers, hunted black sharecroppers across the fields and swamps of Phillips County. Contemporary accounts, including accounts from participants, describe the killing as systematic and deliberate. Men were shot in their fields. Men were shot in the swamps where they had hidden. Some accounts describe bodies being thrown into the Mississippi River. The NAACP investigation that followed estimated somewhere between 100 and 237 black men, women, and children were killed. 5 white men were killed during the entire event. 122 black men were arrested. 12 were sentenced to death. 73 received lengthy prison sentences. The charges were based almost entirely on the testimony of black prisoners, who later stated they had been tortured into confessing. Not a single white participant in the killing was charged with any offense. The NAACP fought the death sentences through the courts for 5 years. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court in Moore v. Dempsey in 1923, in which the court ruled that the trials had been so dominated by mob influence as to constitute a denial of due process. It was a narrow but significant legal victory. The 12 men on death row were eventually released. But here is what I want you to hold on to from Elaine. Here is the detail that I think changes how you understand everything we have been discussing. The federal government did not respond to the Elaine massacre by investigating the killing of between 100 and 237 black Americans. The federal government responded by sending 500 soldiers to suppress the people who were being killed. The army was not deployed against the men hunting sharecroppers through the swamps. The army was deployed against the sharecroppers. The official position of the United States government in October of 1919 was that the problem in Phillips County, Arkansas, was not the mass murder of black agricultural workers. The problem was that those workers had tried to organize a union and hire lawyers. That is not mob violence operating beyond the reach of the state. That is the state. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded in 1909 in direct response to a race riot in Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's hometown, the year before. From its earliest years, the anti-lynching campaign was the NAACP's central legislative priority, and from its earliest years, the NAACP pursued that campaign through the one channel that its founders, many of them lawyers and intellectuals who believed deeply in American democratic institutions, believed should be responsive to documented evidence of systematic murder. They wrote letters to the White House. Not one letter, not a handful, hundreds of letters, thousands of letters over decades, meticulously documented letters, accompanied by reports, affidavits, newspaper clippings, photographs, and witness statements. Letters that described specific lynchings in specific counties with specific names attached. Letters that requested specific federal actions. Letters that asked, with extraordinary restraint given the circumstances, for the President of the United States to acknowledge publicly that what was happening was a crime. The responses they received are among the most revealing documents in American political history. Woodrow Wilson, who received some of the most urgent of these communications during his presidency from 1913 to 1921, including letters about the East St. Louis massacre and about specific lynchings in southern states, responded with what historians have characterized as elaborate procedural evasions. The matter was a state concern. The federal government lacked jurisdiction. The president was deeply sympathetic, but constitutionally constrained. Wilson, who had resegregated the federal civil service within months of taking office, who had screened the birth of a nation at the White House, and reportedly said it was like writing history with lightning, was not constitutionally constrained. He was politically unwilling. Warren Harding spoke more directly about lynching than Wilson had. He gave a speech in Birmingham in 1921 in which he acknowledged it as a problem. He did not push for federal legislation. He did not use the political leverage of his office to move the dire anti-lynching bill, which passed the House that same year, through the Senate. The bill died in Senate committee. Calvin Coolidge said nothing of consequence. Herbert Hoover said nothing of consequence. Franklin Roosevelt, who needed the votes of black Americans in northern cities and the votes of white Southern Democrats in Congress simultaneously, performed what historians have called the most elaborate political balancing act in the history of American racial policy. He spoke in generalities about justice and democracy. He allowed Eleanor Roosevelt to be publicly sympathetic to the anti-lynching cause. He hired more black advisors to informal positions than any previous president. And when Walter White of the NAACP came to him directly and asked him to publicly support the Costigan-Wagner anti-lynching bill in 1934, he refused. The letter he wrote to White explaining his refusal is explicit. Southern Democratic Committee chairmen controlled the legislative agenda. If he antagonized them on lynching, he would lose their support for the entire New Deal. The infrastructure programs, the banking reforms, the agricultural relief, the labor protections, all of it was contingent on the continued political support of men who were simultaneously protecting the right of their constituents to murder Black Americans without federal interference. Roosevelt made a choice, a documented, written, deliberate choice. Economic recovery for white Americans, funded in part by the continued economic exploitation and political suppression of Black Americans, was the priority. The letters went back empty. And outside the White House windows, while those letters were being written and answered and filed, the killing continued. Men were taken from jails. Men were burned alive in front of crowds. Men were tortured for hours while hundreds watched and postcards were made. Women were killed. Children were orphaned. Communities were destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. The sharecropping system extracted its surplus. The convict leasing operations worked their prisoners until they died. The senators who blocked the bills attended state dinners and gave commencement addresses and had their portraits hung in the Senate corridors where they still hang today. And the NAACP kept writing. They kept documenting. They kept filing. They kept building the evidentiary record. Because somewhere in the leadership of that organization, in the offices of James Weldon Johnson and Walter White, and later Thurgood Marshall, there was a belief that the record mattered. That the documentation of injustice was itself a form of resistance. That the letters, even when they came back empty, were planting something, were establishing something that could not be unestablished. They were right, just not in the way or on the timeline any of them would have chosen. Because what the NAACP was doing, decade after decade, was building the case. Not just the moral case, which was overwhelming and obvious to anyone willing to look at the evidence. The legal case, the historical record, the documentation that would eventually make it impossible for the American government to maintain that it had not known, that it had not been told, that it had not received specific detailed requests for intervention and chosen not to intervene. The letters exist. They are in the National Archives. They are in the Library of Congress. They are in university special collections across the country. They sit in their folders, waiting to be read by anyone willing to follow the paper trail all the way to where it leads. Which is to a conclusion that, even now, more than a century after the worst of it, most American public institutions are not fully willing to state out loud. The lynching era was not something that happened to America. It was something America did. With full knowledge, with sustained political protection, with economic beneficiaries at the highest levels of corporate and governmental power, for 70 years. And the question of what that means, the question of what accountability looks like for a crime of that scale and duration, is the question we are going to face directly in the sections that remain. On the night of February 12th, 1946, a 27-year-old Black Army sergeant named Isaac Woodard boarded a Greyhound bus in Augusta, Georgia. He was wearing his uniform. He had just been honorably discharged from the United States Army after 15 months of service in the Pacific. He was on his way home to see his wife in North Carolina. He had served his country. He had survived the war. He had done everything that the rhetoric of American democracy had asked of him. Somewhere in South Carolina, he asked the bus driver if he could step off briefly to use a restroom. The driver refused, then relented, and when the bus reached the next stop, he flagged down the local police chief. The police chief, a man named Linwood Shull, removed Woodard from the bus and beat him with a nightstick. Then he arrested him on a charge of disorderly conduct. Then, while Woodard was in custody, Shull jabbed his nightstick into both of Woodard's eyes. Isaac Woodard, who had been in uniform 15 hours before, was permanently blinded. He was held in jail overnight. No medical care was provided. The next morning, he was brought before a judge, convicted of disorderly conduct, fined $50, and released. It took 2 months for anyone to identify where the blinding had occurred, because Woodard himself, disoriented and in agony, did not initially know what town he had been in. The NAACP found him. They brought his case to national attention. They got the Justice Department to bring federal civil rights charges against Linwood Shull. The case went to trial in federal court in Columbia, South Carolina, in November of 1946. The jury was all white. The verdict took 30 minutes. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause when the verdict was read. Now, I want you to hold the full image of that moment. A man who had served in the United States military, who had worn the uniform of the country that blinded him, was brought before a federal court. The man who blinded him was acquitted. The courtroom applauded, and one of the people who learned about that verdict was a man named Harry S. Truman, who was sitting in the White House at the time, and who, by multiple accounts of people who were present for the conversation, said something when he was told about it that was not particularly eloquent, but was genuinely felt. He said, "My God, I had no idea it was as terrible as that." He was the President of the United States. He had lived in Missouri his entire life. His family had owned enslaved people. He was not a committed racial progressive. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a man who had spent his political career thinking carefully about what Black Americans experienced in the country he led. But he was a man who had served in the military, and something about Isaac Woodard's specific story, a veteran in uniform, blinded within hours of his discharge, acquitted verdict, and courtroom applause, cut through in a way that the NAACP's carefully documented reports had not managed to cut through in 3 decades of trying. What Truman did next was not sufficient. It was not justice. It did not end the lynching era or repair what decades of terror had destroyed. But it was the first significant action taken by an American president in direct response to racial violence since Reconstruction. And understanding why it happened, and why it happened in 1946 rather than 1906 or 1926, is essential to understanding how the lynching era finally, partially, incompletely, began to crack. You have to understand what the Second World War meant to Black Americans in the context of everything we have discussed in the previous sections. More than 1 million Black Americans served in the United States military during World War II. They served in a segregated military, under white officers in most cases, assigned to support roles in disproportionate numbers, denied promotion at rates that reflected the same racial hierarchy they had left behind at home. They experienced racism in the military that was documented, systematic, and sometimes violent. White soldiers attacked Black soldiers on military bases. Black servicemen were court-martialed at higher rates for offenses that white soldiers committed without consequence. German prisoners of war being transported through the American South were sometimes served in restaurants where the Black soldiers guarding them were refused service. They knew all of this. They went anyway. They went because the war created a specific rhetorical opening that Black leaders, writers, journalists, and organizers had been waiting for. A war against fascism. A war against a regime that classified people by race and assigned their human worth accordingly. A war that the United States government was asking its citizens to die in defense of democracy and human dignity. The contradiction between that rhetoric and the reality of life for Black Americans under Jim Crow was not subtle, and it was not lost on anyone willing to look at it. The Black press hammered on it relentlessly. The Pittsburgh Courier launched what it called the Double V campaign. Victory abroad against fascism. Victory at home against racial terror. The two were explicitly linked. The hypocrisy was named, publicly, loudly, in Black newspapers read by millions. And then the soldiers came home. They came home having commanded units, having operated complex machinery, having demonstrated capability and courage under fire in conditions that required more than submission and deference. They came home to communities that understood, viscerally, what had been sacrificed. They came home, many of them, with a different relationship to the concept of submission than the one the sharecropping counties and the Jim Crow courthouses had been designed to produce. And in county after county across the South, the system responded to this with violence. In Georgia alone, within months of the war's end, 4 Black veterans were murdered. In one case, 2 couples were stopped on a country road and shot a combined 40 times by a mob that included a local sheriff. The specific targeting of veterans was not random or incidental. Veterans in uniform represented the most acute symbolic challenge to the racial hierarchy that the terror system existed to enforce. A black man who had survived Guadalcanal or Normandy and came home willing to register to vote, willing to expect to be addressed respectfully, willing to stand at a lunch counter and ask to be served, was a man who had not been adequately broken. And the system that required brokenness responded accordingly. But something had shifted. The returning veterans, many of them, did not absorb the violence the way the previous generation had been conditioned to absorb it. They organized. They registered voters. They joined the NAACP in numbers that swelled the organization's membership from 50,000 in 1940 to nearly 500,000 by 1946. They ran for office. They filed lawsuits. They went to federal courts and filed affidavits. They were in ways that the system found increasingly difficult to suppress completely, refusing. And the Cold War made their refusal politically inconvenient for the United States government in a new way. The Soviet Union was watching. Soviet propaganda pointed to American racial violence with regularity and effectiveness. American diplomats in newly independent African and Asian nations reported that segregation and lynching were the single most damaging facts about American democracy in their diplomatic work. The gap between what the United States said it stood for and what it visibly did to millions of its own citizens was a weapon in the hands of every government that wanted to resist American influence. The State Department understood this. The CIA understood this. And some people in the White House understood it too. The politics of the Cold War created an alignment, fragile, partial, riddled with contradiction, but real, between the interests of the American foreign policy establishment and the long-standing demands of black civil rights organizations. Racial reform was not pursued because it was morally required. It was pursued in the specific ways it was pursued in the late 1940s and early 1950s. In significant part because American racial violence was a Cold War liability. This is not cynicism. It is the documented record. Truman responded to the Isaac Woodard case by creating the President's Committee on Civil Rights, which in 1947 published a report called To Secure These Rights. The report was a comprehensive indictment of racial inequality in American life. It included a specific section on lynching. It called for federal anti-lynching legislation, the abolition of poll taxes, and the desegregation of the military. It used the word murder to describe what was happening. It was the first official government document of its kind in American history. Truman desegregated the military by executive order in 1948. Executive Order 9981. He did not get federal anti-lynching legislation. Southern Democrats in Congress made sure of that. But the desegregation order was real, and it was enforced, and it meant that for the first time since Reconstruction, the full formal weight of the federal government was positioned, at least on paper, against one specific institutional expression of racial hierarchy. Meanwhile, in the courts, something was being built. Thurgood Marshall, then the NAACP's chief legal counsel, was the architect of a systematic legal strategy that most people now know primarily as the Road to Brown versus Board of Education. But the full scope of what Marshall and his colleagues were doing in the late 1940s and early 1950s is worth understanding in the context of the lynching era, because they were not only attacking school segregation, they were attacking the entire legal infrastructure of racial hierarchy, case by case, using the documentation the NAACP had been building for 40 years. They were attacking all-white juries. They were attacking coerced confessions. They were attacking the exclusion of black citizens from grand juries. They were attacking the specific legal mechanisms that had protected lynchers from prosecution for half a century by ensuring that no jury that tried them would contain a single person who might hold them accountable. Shelley versus Kramer in 1948 struck down racially restrictive housing covenants. Sweat versus Painter in 1950 forced the integration of the University of Texas Law School. McLaurin versus Oklahoma State Regents decided the same day, struck down segregation within graduate education. Each of these cases dismantled a specific brick in the legal architecture of Jim Crow. Each of them represented a specific strategic choice by Marshall's team about which brick, removed at which moment, would most efficiently undermine the structure around it. And in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education declared school segregation unconstitutional. The legal edifice that had protected the lynching system for 70 years was not dismantled by Brown. The violence did not stop on the day the decision was handed down. The men who had run the system for decades were still in their courthouses and their sheriff's offices and their state legislatures, but a foundation had been pulled. A precedent had been established. A federal court had said, in language that could not be evaded or procedurally deflected, that the Constitution applied to Black Americans, that the legal fiction of separate but equal was unconstitutional, that the 14th Amendment meant what it said. The system did not accept this quietly. Between 1954 and 1964, the lynching era in its traditional form was ending. Not because the men who had run it changed their minds, not because the violence stopped, but because the specific combination of federal legal pressure, organized mass resistance, Cold War politics, and the national and international visibility of civil rights activism was creating a set of conditions in which the open public execution of Black Americans, the kind that had been announced in advance and attended by thousands and reported as justified civic action in the local press, was becoming politically untenable even for the governments that had protected it. But as the most public form of terror was being suppressed, a different form emerged, more targeted, more deniable, more clearly the work of specific organized groups rather than the diffuse expression of community will. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been a mass organization with millions of members in the 1920s, declining through the Depression and the war, was reconstituting itself in the 1950s, specifically in response to civil rights organizing. It was more violent and less public than its earlier incarnation. It worked through bombings, targeted assassinations, and beatings rather than mass spectacles. It maintained its connections to local law enforcement in ways that were documented but difficult to prosecute. Emmett Till was killed in August of 1955. You know his name from part 1 of this documentary. But I want to return to his case here, because in the context of everything we have been discussing, the specific legal outcome of that case is one of the most revealing documents in the history of American racial justice. Till was 14 years old. He was from Chicago. He did not grow up in the South and had not been fully socialized into the specific codes of deference that the system required of Black people in the Mississippi Delta. He was accused of whistling at or touching the hand of a white woman named Carolyn Bryant in a country store. Roy Bryant, her husband, and his half-brother J.W. Millam took Till from his great-uncle's home in the middle of the night, drove him to a barn, beat him to the point that he was unrecognizable, shot him through the head, tied a 75-pound cotton gin fan to his neck with barbed wire, and threw his body in the Tallahatchie River. The trial lasted 5 days. The all-white jury deliberated for 67 minutes. Not guilty on all counts. One juror later told a journalist that the jury had reached its verdict in about 30 minutes, but decided to take a lunch break first to make it look like they had deliberated. Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, insisted on an open casket. She wanted the world to see what had been done to her son. Jet magazine published the photographs. They were seen by millions. They are credited by numerous civil rights leaders, including John Lewis and Congressman Charles Diggs, who attended the trial, with galvanizing a generation of activists in a way that no amount of written documentation had previously managed. Bryant and Milam, protected by double jeopardy after their acquittal, sold their story to Look magazine in January of 1956 for $4,000. They described, in their own words, exactly how they had killed Emmett Till. Every detail. Calmly. With satisfaction. Because they knew that no court in Mississippi could touch them now. Bryant later recanted her accusation that Till had touched her, admitting it was not true, in an interview published in 2017. She was never charged with anything. Carolyn Bryant Donham died in 2023 at the age of 88. In 1963, 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan placed a box of dynamite beneath the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. It detonated on a Sunday morning during Sunday school. Addie Mae Collins was 14. Cynthia Wesley was 14. Carol Robertson was 14. Carol Denise McNair was 11. 4 children killed in a church on a Sunday morning in front of their families. The lead suspect, Robert Chambliss, was not convicted until 1977. 22 years after the bombing, Thomas Blanton was convicted in 2001. Bobby Frank Cherry was convicted in 2002. The fourth suspect died without ever being charged. Medgar Evers, the NAACP's field secretary in Mississippi, a World War II veteran, was shot in his driveway in front of his home and his children on June 12, 1963. His killer, Byron de la Beckwith, was tried twice in the 1960s. Both trials resulted in hung juries. He was not convicted until 1994, 31 years later. These were not cases where justice was slow. These were cases where justice was refused, where the system that had protected the lynching era for decades continued to protect its practitioners in individual cases for years and decades after the era officially ended, where the same connections between white supremacist violence and local law enforcement that had operated openly in the peak decades continued to operate covertly in the years that followed. Here's the number that I want you to carry into the final section of this documentary. Of the more than 4,000 documented lynchings in the American South between 1877 and 1950, the number that resulted in a conviction of any perpetrator for any crime is so small that historians debate whether it reaches double digits. Not hundreds of convictions, not dozens, not even reliably 10. For 4,000 murders, over 70 years, in a country with functioning courts, functioning law enforcement, functioning federal oversight, and a functioning constitutional provision for equal protection under the law. The system did not fail to deliver justice. The system delivered exactly what it was designed to deliver, and what it was designed to deliver in county after county for generation after generation was impunity. Complete, reliable, documented, structural impunity for the killing of Black Americans. That is the fact that lies at the center of everything we have been examining. That is the fact that the 2005 Senate apology, passed 53 years after the last significant congressional defeat of an anti-lynching bill, tried to address and did not. And that is the fact that brings us to the final question. What do you do with a crime that size? What does accountability even look like for a system that operated openly, that was protected legislatively, that had documented corporate beneficiaries, that killed thousands and injured tens of thousands and dispossessed hundreds of thousands, and that never once produced a meaningful legal reckoning for the people who ran it? The answer that the American government has given, across every administration from Hayes to Biden, is a version of the same answer. Not now. Not yet. Not in a way that carries legal weight. Not in a way that opens the door to the question of what is owed. But there are people who have a different answer. There are scholars who have spent careers building the case. There are communities in the counties where the worst of it happened who have been keeping the record alive. There are legislators who have introduced reparations legislation in every Congress for 30 years. And there is a specific legal and historical argument, one that has never been fully heard in any court, about what the United States government specifically owes to the specific descendants of the people it failed, protected, and in some cases participated in killing. We are going to hear that argument in full. There is a place in Montgomery, Alabama that you should know about. It opened in April of 2018. It sits on a 6-acre site on a hill above the city where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, the city where Martin Luther King Jr. preached at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the city that was the first capital of the Confederacy. It is called the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and it is unlike anything else in the United States of America. When you walk in, you enter a large open pavilion. Hanging from the ceiling and from the structure's exposed steel framework are more than 800 rectangular steel monuments. Each one is roughly the size and shape of a coffin. Each one is weathered, rusted, the color of old blood. Each one is engraved with the name of a county and the names of the people who were lynched there. Some of the monuments have many names. Some have a few. Some have names that are listed only as unknown, because in some counties, the people who were killed were never recorded by name. They were killed and buried and forgotten by a system that had no interest in remembering them. The monuments hang at eye level when you first enter. As you walk forward, the floor descends. The monuments rise above you. By the time you reach the far end of the pavilion, you are looking up at them from below. You are standing where the ground would have been. They are hanging above you the way bodies hang from trees. There is no narration inside the memorial. There is no interpretive signage with careful academic language about racial tension and troubled periods and complicated histories. There are names, there are counties, there are numbers, and there is a silence that, if you let it, will tell you everything that 70 years of careful American euphemism has been trying not to say. Bryan Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative and the architect of the memorial, has spent his career arguing that the United States cannot heal what it refuses to honestly name. That the distance between what this country did and what this country is willing to say it did is not just a moral failure. It is a practical one. That the measurable, documented, economic, and psychological consequences of the lynching era are still present in the communities where it operated. That the wealth gap, the health gap, the incarceration gap, the educational achievement gap that we study and debate and attribute to various cultural factors did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from specific acts, carried out by specific people, in specific counties, across specific decades, that have never been fully reckoned with. This is where the mystery we have been following since the beginning of this documentary leads. Not to a secret, not to a hidden document that, once revealed, changes everything. The mystery leads to something hiding in plain sight, in archives open to the public, in congressional records available online, in the names on the steel monuments in Montgomery. The mystery is why, given all of it, nothing has ever been done. June 13th, 2005. The United States Senate passed Senate Resolution 39, a formal apology for the Senate's failure to enact federal anti-lynching legislation. It passed by voice vote. There was no roll call. No individual senator was required to go on record. The resolution was passed in a manner specifically designed to ensure that no senator would have their name attached to it in a way that could be used against them politically. It was, in the language of the Senate proceduralist, the least visible way to pass a formal resolution. The text acknowledged that the Senate had failed to enact anti-lynching legislation more than 200 times. It acknowledged that Black Americans had been murdered, tortured, mutilated, and burned alive. It used the word atrocity. It expressed, in measured legislative language, something it called deepest sympathies and most solemn regrets. It was not an apology to anyone specifically. It did not name any victim. It did not name any perpetrator. It did not acknowledge any government's participation in or protection of the violence. It did not acknowledge the documented letters from the NAACP to successive presidents. It did not acknowledge the Roosevelt correspondence. It did not acknowledge the filibuster as a tool specifically wielded to protect murder. It did not create any mechanism for investigation, accountability, or redress. It was non-binding. It carried no legal weight. It created no obligation. It opened no door. And 80 senators, a number representing both parties and multiple geographic regions, did not sign it. Not 80 who voted against it. 80 who simply did not add their names to it. Who chose, in 2005, 55 years after the era had formally ended, to not be on the record as opposing the lynching of American citizens. The resolution was introduced by Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana and Senator George Allen of Virginia. Senator Allen's state had been among the leaders in documented lynchings during the peak decades. His constituents' great-grandparents had attended some of those events, and the apology his name was attached to was so carefully constructed to foreclose any legal consequence that it could pass in the United States Senate in 2005 and change nothing at all. James Cameron was alive when it passed. He was 92 years old. In 1930, he was 16 years old when a mob in Marion, Indiana, the same mob in the same photograph I described at the beginning of this documentary, killed his two friends, Thomas Shipp and Abner Smith. Cameron was taken from the jail with them. He was beaten. He was dragged to the tree. He later described feeling the rope being placed around his neck and a voice in the crowd calling out that he was innocent and the mob releasing him. James Cameron was the only known survivor of a completed lynching in American history. He spent the rest of his life, decades of it, trying to get someone in the United States government to say the word clearly. Not in the language of legislative resolution, not in the language of deepest sympathies and most solemn regrets. He wanted someone with authority to say, "This was done. It was done deliberately. It was protected deliberately. And it was wrong." He died in 2006, the year after the Senate passed its non-binding apology by voice vote with no roll call. He was 92 years old. I want to bring you to the present, because the argument that is most commonly made against reparations and against comprehensive legal reckoning is the argument of distance. That what happened was long ago. That the people who committed these acts are dead. That the specific harm is too diffuse, too historical, too embedded in a complicated past to be addressed through any practical present-day mechanism. This argument fails for a specific reason that the economists who have studied it most carefully are not shy about stating. The harm is not historical. The harm is current. The harm is measurable today in specific communities, in specific counties, where the worst of it happened. Economists Elora Darrenoncourt, Chi-Hyun Kim, Moritz Kuhn, and Moritz Schulerich published a study in 2022 examining the racial wealth gap in the United States across 2 centuries. Their findings were not ambiguous. They found that the wealth gap between Black and white American families, which had been narrowing during Reconstruction, began widening sharply after 1880, the precise moment the lynching era was reaching its peak intensity, that it continued to widen through the decades of peak terror, that it has never, at any point in American history, returned to its Reconstruction era trajectory, meaning the deliberate destruction of Black wealth through terror, dispossession, and the systematic denial of economic rights during the lynching era produced a wealth gap that has persisted and compounded across every subsequent generation. The children of the people who were robbed had less. Their children had less. Their children's children had less. Not because of anything those families did or failed to do, because specific acts carried out by specific people, protected by specific institutions, stole specific property and specific futures that compound interest and generational transmission were supposed to build on. A study of the specific counties in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia with the highest documented lynching rates found that those counties today have among the lowest rates of Black business ownership, Black home ownership, and Black educational attainment in the country. The correlation is not coincidental. The mechanism is direct. Capital accumulation that was interrupted by terror in 1890 does not spontaneously reconstruct itself in 1990 or 2020 without the specific conditions that produce capital accumulation. Those conditions were denied to specific communities for specific documented reasons, and the absence of those conditions today is the echo of that denial. This is the argument that Brian Stevenson makes. This is the argument that economists like William Darity Jr. and A. Kirsten Mullen make in their comprehensive case for reparations in their book From Here to Equality. This is the argument that Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee and before her Congressman John Conyers made every time they introduced House Resolution 40, a bill to study reparations for slavery and its aftermath, in every Congress since 1989. Every Congress. 35 years. The bill has never made it to the floor for a full vote. The distance argument also fails for a second reason, which is that the harm was not only economic, the harm was psychological. It was social. It was carried in the body. We know from the field of epigenetics that trauma experienced by parents and grandparents can produce measurable biological changes in their descendants. We know from decades of clinical psychology research that communities that experienced systematic terror develop community-wide patterns of hypervigilance, distrust of authority, and disrupted attachment that are transmitted through parenting practices and through the specific cultural knowledge of what happens to people like us when we trust institutions. The Black Americans who grew up in the counties where lynching was most concentrated did not emerge from that experience unchanged. They raised children who understood, viscerally and accurately, that the institutions around them would not protect them. Those children raised children who understood the same thing. That is not paranoia. That is accurate historical knowledge, and it shapes behavior in ways that produce the outcomes we then study and debate and attribute to factors we are more comfortable discussing. The harm is here. It is in the data. It is in the bodies of living people. There are people right now, in 2024, who are searching for what happened to their great-grandparents. They are doing genealogical research in county courthouses in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and discovering that their great-grandfather's name appears in newspaper archives from 1908 or 1914 or 1923 as the subject of a lynching report. They are discovering that he was buried, if he was buried at all, in an unmarked grave somewhere on property that was subsequently seized and sold to white neighbors. They are discovering that the family story about why the family left that county suddenly and never went back is not just a story. It is a survival narrative built around a specific event that was never discussed, because discussing it was not safe. The Equal Justice Initiative has a project called Community Remembrance that works with communities in the counties with the highest lynching totals to identify specific victims, research their stories, install historical markers, and create a public historical record that did not previously exist. In many of these counties, there is no official historical marker acknowledging that any of this happened. In some counties, the official historical markers commemorate Confederate soldiers, whose names are known while the names of the people those soldiers' descendants subsequently killed are recorded nowhere. In 2019, a soil collection project was launched. In counties across the South, descendants of lynching victims and community members gathered soil from the sites of documented lynchings. The soil was placed in glass jars, labeled with the victim's name and date, and sent to the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum in Montgomery. The project was modeled on a similar project done in memory of Holocaust victims. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means that in 2019, in the United States of America, the most appropriate available model for commemorating American citizens murdered by domestic terror was a Holocaust memorial practice. The soil collection project continued through the pandemic. There are hundreds of jars now in the museum in Montgomery, each one containing a small amount of earth from a specific place where a specific person was killed. Some of the jars have names. Some say only unknown victim. The people who collected that soil are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the communities that were terrorized. They are doing the work of memory because the government that failed their great-grandparents has not done it. I want to be direct with you about something in the last minutes of this documentary. The history we have examined across these 5 sections does not admit of easy conclusion. It does not end with a moment of redemption, a legal victory that repaired what was broken, a national reckoning that allowed the communities devastated by the lynching era to rebuild on acknowledged and compensated ground. It does not end that way, because that is not what happened. What happened is that the lynching era ended, gradually, incompletely, over the course of 2 decades, under a specific combination of pressures, none of which was primarily moral. The Cold War made racial terror diplomatically inconvenient. The Great Migration had moved millions of black voters to northern cities where they constituted meaningful electoral constituencies. The civil rights movement created political pressure that the Democratic Party could not sustain ignoring. And the specific form of mass public terror that had operated openly for 70 years became, in the specific context of television cameras and federal court oversight and international scrutiny, too visible to maintain in its traditional form. The era ended. The reckoning did not come. The men who had run the system died in their beds. The senators who had filibustered anti-lynching legislation for 50 years retired to comfortable old age. The sheriffs who had unlocked jail doors for mobs were buried with honors. The corporate executives whose companies had leased convicts and extracted their labor until they died were commemorated in endowments and foundation names and charitable trusts that still carry their names today. No one went to prison. No property was returned. No account was audited. No debt was acknowledged. And the communities where the worst of it happened, the Mississippi Delta counties and the Georgia Black Belt counties, and the Alabama Hill Country counties sit today at the bottom of nearly every measure of economic well-being in the country. The people who live there are the grandchildren of the people who were terrorized. They are living on the compounded absence of everything that was stolen from those grandparents by violence that was protected by law. The federal anti-lynching law that Congress failed to pass more than 200 times between 1900 and 1952 was finally signed by President Biden on March 29, 2022. It is called the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. It designates lynching as a federal hate crime punishable by up to 30 years in prison. It was passed 120 years after the first Dyer bill was introduced in the House in 1900. The senators who blocked it for 50 years were not named in the bill. The corporate beneficiaries of the system were not named. No mechanism for accountability for the specific crimes committed during the era was created. No door was opened. A law was passed. That is not nothing. That is something. But it is not a reckoning. It is a statement about the future that carefully declines to say anything actionable about the past. Brian Stevenson says that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. And the opposite of the silence that has surrounded the lynching era is not a congressional resolution, or a museum, or a memorial, however necessary and powerful those things are. The opposite of silence is truth. The full truth. The names of the men who organized it. The names of the senators who protected it. The names of the companies that profited from the labor systems it enforced. The specific accounting of what was stolen, from which families, in which counties, in which years. The acknowledgement by the government that failed to act, not in the language of deepest sympathies and most solemn regrets, but in the language of legal obligation, that it failed, that the failure had measurable consequences that persist today, and that those consequences create a debt. That conversation has not happened, not in any official venue, not with legal weight, not in the language of obligation rather than sympathy, but it is coming closer than it has ever been. The Equal Justice Initiative's memorial drew more than 400,000 visitors in its first year. The New York Times 1619. Project, whatever you think of its specific claims, put the history of American slavery and its aftermath into millions of living rooms and classrooms in a way that had not previously happened. Congressional hearings on reparations have heard testimony from economists and historians and descendants of lynching victims. The evidentiary record, the same evidentiary record that IdaBWells began building in 1892, is more comprehensive, more accessible, and more publicly known than it has ever been. And the people who are doing this work understand something that I want to leave you with. They are not doing it for revenge. They are not doing it because they believe that any sum of money can compensate for what was done. They are doing it because they understand, from the evidence, from the historical record, from the data on what communities look like when their capital accumulation is systematically destroyed and never restored, that the silence is itself a form of ongoing harm. Every year that the record is not acknowledged is another year that the communities most devastated by the lynching era do not have the political and legal foundation they would need to begin rebuilding on solid ground. Every year that the government's debt to those communities is unacknowledged is another year that the compound interest on what was stolen grows. Isaac Woodard's eyes were never restored. James Cameron's friends were never given back to him. The 4,084 documented names on the steel monuments in Montgomery are still waiting for the country that killed them to say, in a language that carries weight, that it knows what it did. The monument in Montgomery does something very specific to you as you walk through it. At the end of the pavilion, after the floor has descended and the monuments have risen above you, and you have stood beneath them the way you would stand beneath trees in a county where none of this was a secret, there is a field outside. In that field, identical monuments lie flat on the ground, one for each county, waiting. The Equal Justice Initiative's plan is for each county to claim its monument, to take it home, to install it in the county seat where the killings happened, to put the names in the public square where the people who gathered to watch lived and shopped and went to church. Most of the counties have not claimed them. They are still lying in the field in Montgomery, in the sun and the rain, with the names on them, waiting. That is where the story of the lynching era sits right now, in 2024. Not in the past, not resolved, not healed. In a field, in the rain, with names on it, waiting for the country that put them there to decide whether it is ready to carry them home. Whether it is ready to say what it did. Whether it is capable of becoming the country it has always claimed to be. I do not know the answer to that question, but I know that the 4,084 names on those monuments are not going anywhere, and neither is the truth.